This is Zach, Senior Life Sciences Analyst John Vandermosten. I'm fortunate to have the CEO of Ligand Pharmaceuticals join me to discuss a variety of topics relevant to biotech and our guest path from naval officer to leading one of the most exciting royalty aggregators in the life sciences. I introduce Todd Davis, who begins with his experiences in the United States Navy.
I was the last time I was in the Gulf was '88, so this was prior to the wars that commenced in 1990 and past that. But back then there had been a long period of peace since the Vietnam War. Very little combat, mostly special forces engagements here and there that usually you never know anything about. But that's when Iran and Iraq were at war. And we were really more allied with the Iraqis than we were with Iran at the time. But there had been an accidental missile strike from the Iraqis, which hit the USS Stark. So we had started, kind of deconfliction procedures up in the Gulf at that point. And I was a pilot, but I was also a surface warfare officer. So I had been assigned to a ship in '88 and was basically the missile officer to coordinate missile strikes with aircraft strikes and things like that on board the USS Merrill. And so that's what we were out there. We were out there really doing deconfliction, which was, the Iraqis would call us on the radios and say, is this a U.S. ship? And we'd say no. And they'd say, is this a U.S. ship? And we'd say no. Is this a U.S. ship? We'd say yes. And then they'd say, is this a U.S. ship? We'd say no comment. And then they would engage it. So we were it almost had like a de facto reverse targeting element to it, which you weren't trying to do, but we were making sure they didn't hit any U.S. ships, civilian oil tankers. We were there to keep the seas open, really. And kind of halfway through the deployment, I think we were in the Northern Arabian Sea, the Samuel B. Roberts hit a mine. And it was confirmed through some of the debris that was recovered that the mines were being launched from the oil platforms, the Iranian oil platforms. So we were part of Operation Praying Mantis. We went up into the Gulf. We attacked the oil platform. I think it was called Sassoon. There were some other ships in the arena that attacked another oil platform. We just took those out with 5-inch 54 guns. But there were some significant excursions. It was the first major surface warfare combat since Vietnam, really. And but it was the first major sinking of a ship, I think, since that era as well. And that was, of course, the Iranian ships. Ironically, they were shooting Harpoon missiles at us because we had sold them to the Shah of Iran and his regime over a decade.
They still had them around, I guess. Yeah.
Fortunately, we didn't sell them any parts after that, so they were mostly dysfunctional, missing, or skipping across the water. But it was a pretty big operation that we were calling in A-6 intruders. I think VA-95 was there. VA-95 was dropping laser-guided bombs right on top of the Iranian ships. And it was a bit of I would say, as intense as that is, because you train and train and train, and training seems so routine, and then all of a sudden, one day you're doing it for real. It's weird when people are actually shooting at you. So it definitely gets your adrenaline up. And but it was so lopsided. I think we sunk basically half the Iranian Navy in a period of 24 hours. We were just so technologically superior, much better trained, etc. I will say this about the Navy. I think it was probably the greatest training organization in the history of man. Because if you think about what they do with, for example, an aircraft carrier, they have almost 100% turnover every 4 years.
Yeah. Right.
The majority
probably less than that, actually.
Yeah. The majority of people running the ship have high school degrees. They're between the ages of 18 and 22 and have joined the Navy relatively recently with almost no skills. They can read and write and do math, but basically no specific functional skills. And they're on that ship running nuclear reactors, launching aircraft off the decks, managing weapon systems, radar systems, computer systems, cryptography systems, satellite communication systems, not to mention just running the ship. And they have everything from photo labs. Back when I was there, I did my midshipman intern cruise, my plebe cruise on the USS Ranger. I worked in the photo lab for about a month. We were processing photos, and I remember we had a Chinese delegation come on board the Ranger, and we were taking a bunch of pictures of them. They were wearing the brown suits with the funny brown caps with the red stars on them. So it was a pretty cool era, that whole era. But the Navy is an amazing organization in that regard. And I had it doesn't really hit you when you're 25 or 26. And I wasn't particularly a good officer because I was complaining all the time. I was very self-absorbed. But looking back on it, it's just an amazing training organization. And I had the privilege to go out. One of my friends became an admiral later, and I went out with him when he was a strike group commander to his carrier. And I just remember one of the most impressionable things, I got a tour of the forecastle on, I'm blanking on the name of the carrier now, but nuclear powered, relatively new aircraft.
Gerald Ford, Abraham Lincoln?
Wasn't one of those.
Okay.
But it was like a second class petty officer gave me a tour of the forecastle, and that was his area of responsibility. And he had tattoos from his ankles to his eyebrows. He had clearly had a pretty rough upbringing, probably several run-ins with the law before he joined the Navy. And you could just tell the Navy had transformed him. He had so much pride in this area of the ship. It was spotless. It's where you keep the anchor. The anchor for an aircraft carrier is a chain link is the size of the desk I'm sitting at. They're just massive. But it was spotless. He was incredibly proud of the space. And that was the real impression it left. To be as amazing as the space was, it was really, he was so impressive. And he'd been in the Navy like 7 or 8 years, probably at that point. And this was going to be his career and his life. And it had transformed the man. And that's kind of what the Navy does for people, I think. I didn't really fully appreciate that when you're in the throes of all of it and you're young and selfish and you got your own objectives in life, but it has a very big positive impression on people, I think.
Well, I think it allows you to take on leadership positions much more easily and comfortably. I mean, that's kind of how I feel, is that it trains you in kind of the processes that are necessary to do it right. And, you can step into that role, whatever it may be, whether it be CEO or leading a small group or anything. And it just gives you the tools. Yeah, I mean, you've trained and gained the tools to run things from that perspective.
Yeah, and you have to. It's expected of you. You can't just be an E1, right? That's not an acceptable level of ambition in the Navy. So you're expected to, and it becomes routine to assume leadership positions.
Mm-hmm. Always be growing. I mean, yeah, there's a big push for that.
Yeah.
And I think, well, that's a great intro into your role as CEO at Ligand. And I think Ligand is the most interesting royalty pharma company because you're getting in a little bit earlier stage than maybe some of the bigger royalty pharma companies, and also you have enough capital to really make many meaningful investments. And then I think looking at all industries, I mean, I think royalty pharma is just a fascinating place to be. So you have an enviable role. How did you get there?
It's a circuitous path. I didn't really know what I was doing. There was no grand plan. But I had read a few books while I was, in the middle of the Persian Gulf, and healthcare was going to be a huge growing area because of the graying of America, because of the technology evolution that was occurring. So I just decided to try to get into healthcare, and I interviewed with, there are a lot of military recruiters that try to help military officers transition. So I linked up with one of them and got a number of interviews, and eventually ended up getting an interview with Abbott Labs, and I got a sales position there. So I literally didn't know anything, but I went to work for the diagnostics division, and Abbott's a great training organization too. Mm-hmm. And the culture is very sales and marketing oriented. Now AbbVie, Rick Gonzalez has kind of taken that culture with him. But I learned a lot there. I spent 5 years at Abbott, kind of worked my way up the food chain a little bit. I was a product manager. I launched the first automated PSA test, and had a really good experience. And so that's how I kind of ended up in healthcare. Just a little bit of happenstance, a little bit of self-directed research, really.
Okay. And now you're leading one of the most exciting companies in the space.
Yeah, I mean, it continued on. I'm not really a good big corporate guy. It took me a while to figure that out, but I went to I was at the Navy, then a much smaller organization, Abbott Labs. Then there was a job I wanted in San Diego, and I didn't get it. They gave it to a recently a Marine junior officer that had gone back to business school, and then he went into a Abbott rotational program, and they gave him the job. And I was just thinking, geez, well, what has he done? He doesn't know anything. So you're mad about it for about a day, and then I thought, well, geez, maybe I should just go get an MBA. So that's what I did. And then after getting an MBA, I really wanted to get into a company where I could get to the top management more quickly, where I could be exposed to strategy positions, finance. I'm interested in higher levels, conceptual levels of business. And so I went to a mid-cap company called Elon, which was an Irish drug delivery company, really. And phenomenal experience, run primarily by accountants, amazingly. But in Ireland, they don't have, they have business schools, but the reality is the most talented business people in Ireland go through the accounting firms. That's the blue chip opportunity.
That's the training ground. Okay.
Yeah. So the Irish accountants are like amazing business people, many of them. And so there was just a ton of accountants at Elon that I worked with, and they are really skilled, definitely had different skills than I did. I worked kind of in corporate licensing there, then M&A, and then went back to the drug delivery division for 2 years, where I led the business functions there. And that was a significant business operation. So that was really good experience for me. Got a lot of deal experience there and a lot of operating experience at Elon, which fostered my career considerably. I was about 39 at this point and got a call from a recruiter. And Apex Partners was looking for a specialty pharmaceuticals partner to go to New York. It was really Patrikoff and Co. It wasn't called Apex Partners then. In September, or whatever it was, the summer of 2001, when I was talking to them, it was called Patrikoff and Co. And Alan Patrikoff's kind of the legendary, he's the Kleiner Perkins of the East Coast, basically. He's a legendary venture capitalist. He's 90 now. He's still alive, still an amazing investor. I was there for about 4 years, starting spec pharma companies. We would buy products from large pharma, like nicardipine. We would then recruit management and infuse that with our capital to start new companies. And it was a great strategy in the beginning because it was really arbitrage. You buy products at one-time sales, neglected products from pharma. Not easy to get out of there. It took some deal skills, but you'd start these companies and buy the products at one-time sales, but they would trade in the market as independent companies at 5-time sales. So originally it was really kind of arbitrage. And in my experience, anytime you kind of create a non-competitive opportunity set like that, then everybody starts doing it. And we started Skin Medica, EUSA with our European. Patrikoff and Co. merged with Apex, so we became Apex partners globally. So we had a European set of partners, and we did EUSA, which was EU, US, spec pharma, by acquiring all of the Elon's, my former company's assets in Europe. So that was kind of the third spec pharma startup. So we started 3 spec pharma companies from scratch, actually 4 with Virus Pharmaceuticals, and got a lot of experience on the deal side. and company formation around commercial stage assets. And then in 2006, started Healthcare Royalty Partners, which is when I got into the
And that
royalty.
still exists, right? They're still out there, Healthcare Royalty Partners.
It's called HCRX now. They've converted into a perpetuity entity. They are not public, though they had ambitions to do so. So they now have an evergreen facility, and they call themselves HCRX. But that is the business. I started that with Cowan and two partners, and grew that as a managing partner there from zero to about $4.5 billion under management when I exited in 2018. So good business, focused on commercial stage royalty acquisitions. When we started the firm, we were underwriting those deals to mid to high teens returns, which is really good alpha because that's about 10% risk, I would say. But over time, once again, all of a sudden, all the competition comes in, more money's going after the same assets, returns come down just as they did in acquiring spec pharma assets. And now most of those deals are underwritten to kind of 9 to 12%. They'll put bells and whistles.
Yeah, the return sounds like they're really fallen, like by probably about a third or so, 25%. Yeah.
Yeah, they've really kind of converted almost to a debt strategy. And in fact, some of the deals I would say are very debt-like. A lot of the competing firms like ours would get more creative because Royalty Pharma just was so big and had such a cost of capital advantage that was difficult to compete with them. Like you've gotten a bidding war with them, it was below our targeted return. So we did a lot more synthetic royalties. We actually trademarked synthetic royalties and started doing a lot of those, which is really the creation of royalties through a project financing. So we started doing a lot of those deals and kind of grew the firm assets under management that way. And I was there through 2018, and I was kind of, semi-retired, although I seemed to be working more than ever. I moved to Florida and I'd been on the board of Ligand since 2007. Okay. And in 22, they asked me to run Ligand. So that's when I kind of went back to work full time and started doing this.
And the interesting thing about Ligand, and you were talking about it there, is that the commercialized assets, the return has been compressed, just because of the competition. So Ligand's approach is to get something in the later stages of development, a couple of years away from commercialization, which is a very attractive space. There's more risk there, obviously, but obviously there's also more return. Can you talk about that objective of Ligand to focus on that, its sweet spot there in the, I guess, the phase 3 or a couple of years away from commercialization zone?
Yeah, well, that fits us strategically for several reasons. One reason is, just with our commercial assets and the assets that are already within our development stage portfolio, we're going to grow at approximately 20% for years, at least probably 8 or 9 years. So that's embedded in our current asset portfolio. And so we're really focused on kind of the longer term growth trajectory of Ligand. So timing wise, it fits for us to be doing deals around phase 2B and phase 3 assets, because they'll be launching in whatever it is, 2027, 2029, and they'll take us through towards 2040. And this really should be a compounding strategy. In fact, it is. We're simply reinvesting our cash flows now. We're growing at 20%, and that rate of growth should compound over time because our cash flows are going to grow. Our average investment size is going to go up, and the returns, I think, will be pretty steady here. We're pricing our deals the same way equity is priced because we're taking equity-like risk. But it is a pretty inefficient market for what we're doing. And I think in general, there's some real challenges in biotech financing.
Todd, how much cash flow do you think you're going to generate over the next 12 months or so?
We'll generate about 120 million.
Okay.
Cash
flow. So if you're growing at 20%, that means you're probably going to get maybe 145 million a year after that. Does that sound about right? So you'll be able to invest in and that compounding that we talked about. I mean, that's an outstanding approach that I think maybe some people don't grasp, at first look. that you guys have that perhaps others don't have.
Yeah. Yeah, we have over 80 development stage partnerships, and we have about 13 major commercial products that are driving our growth, including, our lead growth drivers now are Filspari. It's
Hmm.
just at the
Right.
beginning of its growth trajectory. And we think if FSGS is approved, they're going to exceed $2 billion in sales on that product, would be our guess, or our
So,
estimate.
so Filspari, just so people know, and tell me if I'm wrong, but you have the primary indication, but there's also another indication, FSGS, which I think you said, and then there's also geographical expansion as well. So you kind of have all these from like 1 to 4, right?
Yeah, 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 exactly. There's kind of geometric growth there
Yeah,
for multiple
right.
reasons.
Better way to say it.
Growing the number of indications, growing the geographies we're in, and the product just launched in the US, so it's just growing in the US as well. And some very positive things have happened in favor of Filspari. I think the Parasol Group, which was um, a group of leading nephrologists, the FDA, other thought leaders in industry, kind of reviewing the endpoint measurements. And what was really most uh, meaningful was a surrogate endpoint for IgA nephropathy, and they've really anchored around proteinuria, which there's very clear data for Filspari on that. So that's very favorable. I think that's the right conclusion as well, importantly, clinically, but that's very good for Filspari in terms of measuring its efficacy. And that's true in FSGS as well. So they've now filed and should be an accelerated approval, which would mean that could be approved sometime in September of this year.
Okay.
And although there's proportionately fewer patients, I don't remember exactly, 60% or so of the number of patients there are in IgA nephropathy, they're probably going to use a higher volume of the drug. So the revenue generation in an FSGS will be about equal to the opportunity set in IgA nephropathy. We have a 9% royalty on that drug. And
That's pretty
so
big.
it's a
Yeah.
$2 billion drug. That's $180 million of 100% margin cash flow to us in a single asset. We also have a 3% royalty in Ohtuvayre.
Okay.
And
Would
uh,
you say that's your kind of your second most interesting asset after Filspari, Ohtuvayre?
yeah, in terms of really growth driving right now,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
And they're doing an amazing job launching that product at Verona. Wells Fargo put out a really good note. I was kind of knew this. I knew it was going well, but they quantified it. The analyst there, blanking on his name, quantified it and showed all of the COPD launches in the last several years and where they stood in terms of the patient penetration and the ramp rate. And this is the most successful COPD launch in history so far,
Mhm.
and including Trilogy and some of the other really big drugs that are out there. So
Yeah.
they're on their way to a blockbuster. If this continues for another couple quarters at the same growth rate, this should definitely exceed $3 billion in total sales. So
Okay.
that's another 90 million or so in cash flow to us. And we have a number of other shots on goal that are very attractive. Capvaxive is growing very nicely. We have a low single
Okay.
royalty on that. Merck's doing a great job marketing that drug. A lot of good partners. But one thing about our model is, our partners are doing all the work and making all the money for us, right? We invest capital or license technology to them early on, and then we're
Mhm.
passive partners. And that's
Okay.
part of our strategy. I mean, we want to be passive. And the reason we want to be passive is because there's lots of talented teams out there. There are lots of good assets out there. And we want to be capital allocators because that's a much more leverageable business model. So
Right.
we try to be selective in terms of the teams and the assets that we partner with. And I think we've made some good historical decisions. I think we're making some good decisions now. It's really the combination of those two things that matter at the end of the day in terms of how these things go. And we're having, in addition to, I think, executing pretty well, we're having some really good luck, which never hurts. So that's great.
It's, I think it's important to note for investors how your profile is a little bit different, maybe from a single product biotech company. Maybe some investors kind of think of them in the same opportunity set. But the nice thing about the royalty approach is that in the early days, a lot of times, there are a lot of costs, right? And your profit may be quite low, but Ligand is getting a royalty on sales, right? So independent of how much it costs to initially commercialize it or launch it, that doesn't affect the pay profile for you guys and the investors in Ligand. Maybe you can accentuate that, because I think it's a pretty important factor that maybe some people may not explicitly realize.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of advantages to royalty investing. There's some disadvantages as well. You got to be careful about. It's different. That's for sure. One advantage of if you do a deal with a company, and at the end of the deal, instead of we give them capital in return for that, we have a royalty contract in place rather than equity documents or debt documents. And so, if the product is successful, then we'll be successful. If it's not successful, we won't be. So, but the advantages of it is the first advantage is royalties are non-dilutable. So if there's some twists and turns, and there often are in biotech development because it's complicated.
Very true.
If we have a 5% royalty, our investment percentage ownership doesn't get cut in half. We still have a 5% royalty. Our IRR is affected because the launch is delayed and it'll get online a little bit later. But ultimately, you kind of can hold your portfolio without the highly dilutive effect that you would normally have in equity. In equity on the private side, you have a little more pressure to follow on to keep your companies financially strong. And especially on the private side, that can be a very difficult position to be in a market like this. So I like the royalty investing, but also even once you're commercial, we are paid a royalty as a percentage of net sales. So you're basically getting paid off the top line. So there can be heavy twists and turns in the working capital requirements after you launch as well. And so we're a little bit buffered from that risk. Obviously, our partners, we want them to be financially strong. So we're supportive of them. And in fact, like with Palvella is a good example. That's a great company in phase 3 in an indication for microcystic lymphatic malformations. Ligand first did a project finance with them. And then, like many small private biotech companies, there's some twists and turns there. And we bridged them with $5 million. We kind of restructured, moved the royalty rate up a little bit in return for that. And then we supported them in 2 equity rounds as well. So we will follow on and support our companies in equity rounds. As a public company running a royalty strategy, we don't have mandate restrictions. My mandate restrictions are my investor expectations. So I have to be very communicative with my investors, be very clear about what our strategy is, and make sure that they're supportive of what we're doing. But that's different than a limited partnership agreement in a private company where you raise 10-year lockup capital and it's written down what your mandate is and you're restricted from going outside of those bounds. That can be somewhat restrictive and not allow you to pivot if the market changes a little bit. If the market changes a little bit with us, we can communicate with our investors and say, hey, we're turning 5 degrees starboard and tweaking the strategy a little bit. And the investors will usually come along with you if you have a sound strategy. So it's an advantageous to be in. I've kind of been, the reason I came back to work really was I think this is an exciting opportunity to really partner with public shareholders in this strategy rather than do it on the private side.
Yeah. One of the themes that I've been talking about recently in interviews and things like that is the patent cliff that's coming up. There's a report by Morgan Stanley that came out in the last few months, and identified about $180 billion of sales that will lose patent protection by 2030. I think they named Amgen, BMS, Merck as kind of some of the biggest losers out there. And some of the products that are on that list are Kadcyla, it's an ADC. There's Trulicity, then of course Keytruda and Opdivo, which are the very well-known checkpoint inhibitors. Those are all falling off, and it seems like Ligand fits into an interesting space here, where some of the the opportunities that you have could fill this patent cliff. And I'd like to hear about what you think about the patent cliff. Is it different from previous patent cliff periods out there? And what role does Ligand have in potentially filling that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that just my view is that you kind of see cycles of this, and this was big news in the 2000 to 2005 arena, of time as well, where there were big companies facing very significant patent cliffs. All companies face that. I mean, the reality is our entire industry relies upon the patent legal system. And that is a legal monopoly granted to us by the government in exchange for sharing all of the information, the new invention, in the form of a patent. So you have to share all the information rather than keeping it a trade secret, which could be a strategy. And that's really good for everybody. The issue for us, of course, in the biotech arena is that patents are 20 years. And that may sound like a long time, but technology moves abreast. Competition is abreast of you. And so,
well, and also you may lose half of that in development and other things like review or things like that, right?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that you have to file the patents long before you are commercializing the product, because you're competing with other potential patent filers. And you want to be the first to file in a certain area of innovation so that you're not blocked by somebody else's patent. So there's huge calculations going on about when do we file our patents. And on average, that's about 8 years before a product is actually approved for marketing. So on average, companies have about 12 years of patent life when they actually start generating revenues. And of course, the first year, maybe even two, they're not even profitable. They're investing in market development.
Right.
So they really have about 10 years to recapture the return on over 10 years of investment. So there's a huge J-curve investment cycle within our industry. I don't think when people talk about pharmaceutical pricing, right, they really fully understand the returns. But if you just look at people think they're just massive profits in the pharmaceutical industry, and it can be very profitable. But if you look at the average P&L, in fact, if you merged all the large pharma companies together and did the math on the combined P&L, they've got about 20% net income margins or so. That's a lot less than some other industries. So, I think that there is a lot of money plowed back in to research to, overcome the patent cliffs that they'll be facing. And they've got a lot of research ongoing. I mean, I know Merck's facing some patent cliffs, but, they're launching Capvaxive, which I think is a really excellent vaccine, into the Prevnar franchise, which is a $6 billion franchise. So there's a big opportunity there for them to grow that space. And they've got a lot of other things going on. And that's the risk we all face. Our role, like any other company, is to focus on our own patent cliffs. And 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I guess now, when I joined the company as CEO, everybody was focused on our Kyprolis patent cliff. Kyprolis is an Amgen oncology drug, and it will go off patent and there'll be generic entry in late 2027. And that's a big drug. That's about $40 million of cash flow and royalties to us. It's been a great drug for patients and for Amgen from a business perspective and for us. But it's your job to work through those patent cliffs. And everybody was asking what we were going to do about the Kyprolis patent cliff 2 years ago. Now, when you're looking at Filspari and Ohtuvayre and Capvaxive and all the other things in our portfolio that are growing, we never get that question anymore. And our next major patent cliffs are 8 and 9 years out.
Okay.
So
well, and you're also making subsequent investments that kind of keep on layering on more and more to that.
That's exactly right. I mean, we just did the Castle Creek deal in trophic epidermis bullosa, and that is a very high unmet clinical need disease. There is one treatment out there with Crystal now, which is effective, but has its limitations. This is going to be very complementary to that, we think. Very excited about that. That could be a very large drug. We have a nice, we syndicated that deal, so it's a high single-digit royalty, but we have a mid-single-digit that accrues to ourselves at Ligand. Things like that will be big contributors to us in the future, we believe. The microcystic lymphatic malformation drug, Palvella, that could be a very big drug. Currently, 0 treatments for those patients. We love 0 to 1 strategies. Currently, 0 treatments. This will be the first treatment. We have that with Zelsuvmi, which we should be launching here mid-year. So, those are the types of opportunities we like, and those will solve our patent cliffs that we have out in the mid-2030s.
Okay, very good. Yeah, and I think there's a very helpful, for people watching, there's a very helpful chart that you guys provide in your presentations that show all of the different layers of products and how they're expected to contribute to the revenues of the company.
Yeah, that's been a good communication tool. I think the significant majority of our top investors are generalists. They want exposure to biotech, innovation, etc. But it's hard to build a portfolio of your own biotech companies if you don't do that every day, all day for a living. It's very complicated.
Right.
So we kind of offer exposure to all of that, but combined with very predictable growth profile. We're profitable. We'll never have a gun at our head in terms of financing risk. That's it. That's one of the biggest risks in biotech. It's not you have the clinical risk, the regulatory risk, CMC risk, market risk, and all of these risks. Financing risk is a huge risk for biotech investors.
Yeah. Well, that's the dilution problem that a lot of small cap investors have faced in recent years.
Exactly. And so that's you kind of have to forecast that into your underwriting. And so all of these things really have to be considered. We solve a lot of those problems with a very well diversified, but profitable and rapidly growing portfolio.
Great. Another theme that's emerged over the last probably decade or decade and a half is China and kind of its role in the global biotech universe. And I believe, and Todd, correct me if I'm wrong, I did some research on this probably like 8 or 9 years ago, but I think they were going to allocate something, the country was going to allocate 4% of their GDP to either technology itself or life sciences technology. And that's a huge amount of money, right? They have many, many universities. They have, a lot of clinical trial sites, a large population. So it's very, I'm not sure if easy is the right word, but they have all the resources that are necessary to run a lot of clinical trials and do a lot of research. And I think maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe there's some suspect about the quality of that research, but it seems to have improved. And I've had some discussions with other executives, and they have spoken to me about a trend that they're noticing where in China, there is this fast follower approach where if there's a new molecule that was perhaps innovated in the United States or in Europe or something, that, if it shows some early promise, they'll jump onto it and do a whole bunch of derivatives of that, trying to find, a follow-on molecule that is either as good or is better. And what's happened is there's been a lot of M&A. I won't go into all of the examples of that, but there's been a lot of M&A where Western companies have tried to jump into a certain area by buying a Chinese asset that's been developed like that. And it's, it's an interesting thing. I kind of wonder how that'll evolve and how it will change the environment in the space. But would love to hear your thoughts, from your perch as a CEO of a company that is looking at a broad variety of investments. How that what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think China wants to be competitive in this arena, and we've seen this before. I mean, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, China. We innovated and started the semiconductor industry.
Right here in Texas, actually, just down the street.
That's right, Texas
Texas Instruments.
Yeah, was a key early innovator, and we basically outsourced the manufacturing ourselves to. This is a theme of the current administration, and they're spot on. We outsourced all the manufacturing for cheaper labor to Taiwan, Japan, etc. And innovation happens close to manufacturing. That's really true. I don't know if it's as true in the biotech industry, but it's certainly true in general. Plus, we kind of need the manufacturing jobs. Not everybody is going to learn to code, as they say, right? We need those types. So China has a very directed strategic effort. We're not so coordinated in a democracy. There's different
Right.
opinions.
Yeah.
Which
has its pluses and minuses, we should say.
Yeah, we don't.
There's good and bad with being directed, I guess. Right.
We're not as good at the long-term strategic, direction and holding it, which is a problem. But I really like the current direction we're talking about, and we have to use our market power here because China is innovating pretty rapidly. It is true they have been using kind of mostly fast follower development strategies, but their universities innovation is growing rapidly. And that's part of the cycle of innovation that you go through. First fast following, then they're going to start doing really innovative stuff. And so it's competitive. But right now, if you look at kind of the global consumption of innovative therapeutics, we're a $250 billion market. They're 15. So all these other countries that are doing it need access to our market. And our leaders need to use that market power to make sure we've got balanced trade and fair competition. We didn't really do that very well historically, in my view. We haven't done that very well. And we really need to use our market power to do that. So that's cutting deals with other countries. We need to be good at that. And they're going to want access. We've got a lot of cooperation kind of ongoing already between our VC firm. Many VC firms have co-invested with new Chinese molecules, right? Because there's a lot of fast follower molecules that look promising coming out of China. And I think OrbiMed's done like 6 deals. NEA's done a couple. Some of our blue chip firms, Bain Capital, some of our real blue chip firms have started to do that with NewCo formation around Chinese molecules. And that's good for us, I think. A lot of that innovation will happen here. A lot of the clinical development will happen here. But we need to really make sure that we use our market power to enforce fair trade. And as a really an intellectual property strategy, which is what we are investing in teams and assets, but it's all underpinned by intellectual property. That's where there's a big gap. And China has historically, I think, kind of tried to take the shortcuts on the IP side. Right, and we have been hesitant.
Yeah, the whole forced technology transfer, which has been a huge problem in the tech space.
Yeah. So we need to use our market power to help them fix that. I mean, the Chinese investors will eventually want a robust IP system as well. The Chinese innovators will benefit.
Right. Yeah. After they innovate and kind of catch up, then they're kind of in a bad position if they don't have the same protections that we have in the United States.
Exactly. So, mutual interest will eventually align. We need to use the relative market power now to make sure that happens to our benefit, obviously. So, that's what I think, at the highest levels, we need to focus on. But I think we're doing all the things right at the industry level. We're engaged with China. There's lots of co-investment around Chinese molecules that will be good for American patients in the future at some point. Um, but we do need to kind of fix our mutual IP systems. As a royalty investor, I think most of the royalty funds out there are very reticent to invest in royalties
Mm.
that are underpinned or your return
Right.
relies upon the IP system outside of Western law.
Yeah.
We do deals mostly in arenas of Western law. Europe, the US, Australia, Japan's good. That's where we can rely upon our returns. Um, and so that's a really important underpinning that we need to solve some problems in. And now's the time to do it because we are still the big consumers.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. The longer you wait, the harder it'll be.
Yeah.
One of the wrenches in the system might be the cut to NIH funding, and I'm sure we've all seen the articles on some of the innovative things that have been funded through NIH funding, and one thing as an investor that you and I probably know is that there isn't a lot of public investment in preclinical research. It's just there's for 1,000 programs, maybe one or two make it into the clinic, or maybe it's a little bit higher than that, but maybe one or two make it to approval. So it's a pretty hard area to come up with an investment profile for, because it's such a low percentage of success. And with the cut of that, does that affect the United States long term competitiveness in the life sciences space, or does it get filled in with private investment? Do the big biopharmas come in and build up their teams to do some of that early research? And what happens here? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. I think this is a blip in time. I think for good reason. I mean, it's hard to argue that the government as a capital allocator is doing a great job. And so the current administration is just putting a pause, say, hold up, we really suck at capital allocation. We're going to kind of change things up. It's not business as usual. That doesn't mean they're going to defund NIH. I know it's highly disruptive and probably stressful right now if you've got a big grant that's been put on pause. So not good. And the NIH is a very important part of the ecosystem. They're doing, the really early broad research that you can't get paid for in a commercial biotech startup.
Right, exactly.
And by the way, the DoD does some of that too. A lot of our innovation,
BARDA, things like that, exactly.
In this country comes out of the DoD, early innovation and repurposing military technology and innovation. So we do really need and rely upon this. But I'm confident that the faucets will be turned on, hopefully in a timely manner. I think this whole DOGE effort, there'll probably be some follow-on effort, but the initial DOGE thrust is like 130 days, I think. And they are trying to make improvements to the system. Like, just for example, I know that one of their objectives, as disruptive as this and scary as this might seem right now, is the splits. So if you fund research at Harvard, for example, 70% of that grant goes to the lab, 30% goes to the institution. Now, I think I can say this as an alum. I don't think Harvard as an institution really needs 30% of that grant.
They got plenty of money.
They've got more money. I mean, they've got so much money that they
definitely have a better balance sheet than the government does.
I can tell you at the business school, they plant flowers and they rip them out, and then they plant again and then they rip. They have such a huge landscaping budget they can't spend it all. So I just think that what they're proposing now in DOGE and in the current administration is to just make the split 85-15. So there'll actually be more dollars going directly to the innovation as opposed to university administration.
Yeah, overhead costs.
Overhead, yeah. So I think I'm optimistic that it will be directed. The faucets will be turned on, and with some improvements, and hopefully in a very thoughtful way.
Another thing that has been pretty apparent over the last few years, and since COVID ended, is just the biotech winter. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but we've had a few years of difficulty in funding some of these smaller companies. And in my point of view, I feel like the science has really advanced quite a bit, but the funding and kind of the market prices of many of the smaller companies, which is where I focus, has kind of gone down. So there's been a divergence, which is great for companies like Ligand because it means that the value for you as an investor is dramatically better than it was before. So, a couple questions for you on that, given your perspective and position. What kind of opportunities are there right now, and how much capital is there ready to jump in? And I guess the third question would be is, what is the catalyst that's going to drive that change if there is a lot of capital on the sidelines, which I believe there is?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I think the biotech financing market is a little bit broken because most of the biotech, stock fortunes rely upon a small group of specialist funds that trade amongst each other, really. And it's not a deep market, and there are a lot of haves and have-nots. So I can't tell you I know exactly how it's going to play out. We're in the business of kind of turning over rocks, mostly with the have-nots, because if if things are going really well and you've got
they don't need the capital,
the backing of the big blue chip funds, the BVF, RA Capital, I mean, then you're doing pretty well. But there's a lot of value out there that's kind of, I think, overlooked. Sometimes the capital itself can fix the problem that exists. There are problems with these companies sometimes, but they can be fixed. And the market's not always too discreet. A lot of it, the investing is momentum oriented. So it's a good market for us. You're right. I would like to see kind of broader and deeper investment and more consistent investment in the market, but I just don't think we can count on that. Here's the good news relative to the Chinese markets, right? Because they're going through their whole financial biotech market is just developing. So what are they doing? They're coming to the U.S. market. They're bringing their molecules to the U.S. market for financing. So we, on a relative basis, we have a very good financing market for these types of things. But it is really challenging for some of the small companies that we think have good ideas. And it's a big consideration for us, John, because when we invest in a company, even if they have a good management team and a good asset, and we think our capital gets them through a good inflection point, we need them to be financially strong beyond that inflection point.
Yeah.
So that's part of our.
We still need to commercialize and have sales, right?
Yeah. We kind of have to handicap our investments accordingly, and try to estimate their access to capital beyond ours. That's an important consideration we're making in all of the deals that we do. And we've got a few things. We'll take on a little bit of financing risk. We take on the financing risk with ZELSUVMI, right? So we're financing that, So we're relying on outside capital to launch that product commercially.
Right.
So we need to understand these markets. And by the way, that's, I think, going to be a fantastic product. There's so much latent demand.
Yeah, the molluscum contagiosum.
Yeah, molluscum contagiosum. I get pinged on LinkedIn, a couple times a week.
Well, I have to say, I used to work with that company, and the executives there would say that they had messages all the time from parents demanding the drug, and it sounds like that's carried through to Ligand as well.
Highly motivated mothers.
Yes, right.
Yeah, it's a skin infection for those that don't know, but I think we bought that out of bankruptcy. The product subsequently got approved. It had already been filed when we got it out of bankruptcy.
Right.
It got approved, and I just think that's going to be a great product. But right now in the public markets, this is kind of an example of I think where we need more depth. The dermatology is out of favor. Financing product launches is out of favor, and the capital markets do kind of move in herds.
Yeah.
So the private market's very difficult to fund that. I will tell you, we've got line of sight on getting a deal closed, so we're very happy about that. It's going to be a phenomenal deal for the investor, we think, but that's okay because we're kind of sharing the equity value with them, and we're going to end up with a nice royalty, which was our original objective on what we think is a great drug. And we also took the financing risk when we spun out our protein expression business. We needed to get that financed.
Mhm.
Called Primrose Bio now. It's a private company. And we had a good, a smaller private equity firm come in called 1315 and finance that. So they're off and running and are equity backed with some partners. So that's a very good thing for us and the long-term viability of that business. So we take advantage, it's true, of the capital market situations, but we have to live within them and operate within them too. We depend upon them. It's an ecosystem.
What do you think the catalyst is, Todd, that gets more capital and eyeballs on the space? I mean, because everything's cyclical, right? If a few months after COVID, there was just tremendous interest in biotech, right? You saw everything go up, a lot of capital flowed in there. You had preclinical companies, that would get billion-dollar valuations and IPOs. That's not happening now. But is there a catalyst you see out there that could potentially do that? I mean, in my opinion, I think M&A is a pretty important one because investors, especially in these early stage non-revenue generating companies, they don't want to see an exit within a year or two, right? So if you're at phase 1 or phase 2, that is a deal or a buyout or something like that, or an acquisition. And if there's not a lot of M&A, it's like, well, where's it going to come from, right? Because if you wait till it's commercialized, that could be 6-7 years away. And I think, most investors' horizons aren't that long for a cash out, right? What do you think that's the catalyst, or is there something else in combination with that might get us going?
Yeah, I think there's a few factors that are really important. That's definitely one. I mean, biotech, the whole business model only makes sense with a robust M&A market. Very few biotechs are built to become virtual.
Yeah, that's
or Amgen, right, or Gilead. I mean, there's very few.
Commercializing yourself is an extremely risky and high fail rate type of thing.
Yeah. And so the entire biotech universe relies on a robust M&A market for the most part. There are exceptions, of course, especially in the orphan space. People will navigate their own launches very effectively, I think, sometimes. The macro is really important. I mean, we went through a period of significant free money, basically. And that's a big catalyst. And it kind of combines with you've got to have kind of that FOMO, a little bit of FOMO in the air. The markets do move in herds. It's just like I was saying, for whatever reason, I think because people didn't do well in spec pharma and dermatology for a while. Why? Because the payers got very negative on paying, premium prices for Me Too products. And they gained a lot of power. So they shifted reimbursement towards the generics, appropriately so, by the way, I think. You should not make a ton of money for making a marginally improved product. The product developers get that now. But sometimes what happens is people throw the baby out with the bathwater. So when you have something really novel for molluscum contagiosum, like Tumi's going to be, they think, oh, it's dermatology. Yeah, but people
they combine it in with everything else.
Yeah, you've got to scratch below the surface, and the market moves in such a herd mentality that it's really hard to get attention. And there's a reason for that. It's not that the investors are some of the smartest people I know, right? That invest in these companies, but they have to invest in things that they know other investors will appreciate.
Right.
The stock won't go up. It's basic math. So that's just the reality. I still am very intrinsic value oriented. So I know the value of a unique product addressing a high unmet clinical need in the market. And in a royalty investing model, you can wait for the cash flow. You can wait for the cash flow on the product. We exit from the success of the product off of the product cash flows. We're not waiting for market events. We don't need to. Now, we do need the capital markets to make sure our companies are funded downstream and they're financially robust enough to have access to capital. But we're not relying on that for our exit strategy. So we have a very different mentality around these things. And we like the deep value of things like ZELSUVMI that are unappreciated by the capital markets.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both an advantage, but you've got to be careful because we need the access to the capital markets to launch the product because we are not going to go into sales and marketing business. We're not going to go into the clinical development business. We're going to stay lean and mean. We've got about 40 employees now, and if we maintain our discipline on that, then we're going to just have our immense operating leverage will be a huge advantage going forward.
Yeah. I thought we could wrap up with an interesting area of gene therapy. And I think that's particularly interesting for Ligand is because I think you made your first gene therapy investment with the Castle Creek Biosciences just a short time ago. Maybe you can share with us what you think of gene therapy. I mean, it's a little bit more difficult, and I think the costs are sometimes a little bit higher than obviously small molecule, right? How do you fit in gene therapy into the investment universe, and what led you to make that your first investment in the space?
Yeah, I think we're pretty agnostic on therapeutic area and approach, really scientific approach. What we care about is the overall risk, and that the asset we're investing in, if it's development stage, of course, is addressing very high unmet clinical need. And so in Castle Creek, you have really a horrific disease with this dystrophic epidermis bullosa. And the market's underserved. Even with Crystal's product out there, which works pretty well, it has limitations on the body surface area it can treat, things like that.
And I believe the disease, just so people know, I think your skin kind of peels off. It doesn't adhere to itself, and it sloughs off. Is that correct?
Yeah, it wounds open and reopen.
Okay.
You're missing a gene that basically directs the connectedness of tissue.
Mm-hmm.
So the tissue's disconnecting. So you got opening wounds, closing wounds. It can be horrific, and it can affect, the hands. You'll get severe wounds on your hands and feet, and then when the tissue closes, you'll start to develop web hands and web feet. You kind of end up with clubs, and it's very painful. It's really one of the worst orphan diseases I've looked at, and I'm really it's shocking, some of the clinical situations. So launching another product in that category is very rewarding, but should also be very good for business because there's so much unmet need. But our criteria isn't gene therapy or non-gene therapy or any other approaches. It's the level of protection that it has. We need underlying intellectual property. It has to be addressing a very high unmet clinical need. It definitely does that. It has to meet our investment size. Our asset allocation limits are about 50 million because we're trying to grow a diversified portfolio, and we don't want to put more than 50 million at risk on a binary bet. And no matter how promising something is, if it's not approved by the FDA for marketing yet, we consider that a binary bet. So that kind of drives us into certain categories. We do a lot of orphan because that's usually very high unmet clinical need, and a $30 to $50 million check can make a big difference on the cost of a total orphan trial. It doesn't make a huge difference, for example, in a trial in major depressive disorder that,
right, because they're huge. There are 10,000 people in that one.
Yeah, there's 10,000 people. It's $300 million. And so we kind of naturally end up focusing in certain areas that I think really work strategically and really work from a business perspective as well. It's a great business, but it's also pretty rewarding because you're going after the biggest problems in the worst diseases and, trying to help those companies that are working on them, deliver their solutions to the market.